or statistical and data science community. The goals of this group is to bring innovations in statistical methodology and data science in new research and public policy collaborations. We want to work to accelerate the development of innovative approaches that impact societal problems. And we want to provide statisticians with an understanding of the societal problems that stimulate their interest, and develop statistical action items to better inform public policy, and particularly facilitate new collaborations among statisticians and those working to understand and mitigate the problem. A very brief history. Our initial inaugural Ingram Olkin Forum was in June 2019. That was when we still had in-person meetings. It was held in Washington, D.C. at the American Statistical Association. And we had sessions on these topics related to gun violence. The title was Gun Violence, the Statistical Issues. And the topics were emerging data sources, gun violence trends, policing gun violence, assessing gun violence risks, and evaluating initiatives, and police shootings. And there's a white paper on our website, a call for statisticians to engage in gun violence research, and that will be published also in the Statistics and Public Policy publication, which is an online journal. We are currently in the midst of another Ingram Olkin Forum on unplanned clinical trial disruptions, which was a very topical topic that we began after the pandemic began. And we have another upcoming Ingram Olkin Forum on the opioid crisis, which will be organized later this year. Now, I will now turn this over to Claire to introduce our speakers today on this very interesting topic we have. Please, use of force. Claire?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so today's forum is on police use of force. Just as a general introduction to the forum, I think many of us know that excessive use of force by police presents an urgent problem to sociologists, statisticians, policymakers, and the general public. Topics of interest in general include issues with data quality, the role of civilian and officer characteristics, the effect of departmental training, and other topics. The methodologies used to analyze these topics in police use of force in general are varied, and results are often incompatible. So our speakers today will describe their perspective on the steps statisticians and scholars might take to effectively analyze use of force data and reform efforts, and to communicate this information to the public. So we have three great speakers today. I'm really excited to hear their perspectives. First, we'll have Dean Knox, next Robin Engel, and finally Travis Riddle. I'll introduce them briefly before their individual talks, and I will turn my video on when you have about 2 minutes left to speak. But they'll give about 20-minute presentations, and then we'll have an extended amount of time at the end for questions and dialogue. So if you have questions throughout, you can definitely put it in the Q&A, but we will have an extended Q&A session at the end, not after each individual speaker. But yeah, with that, I'd like to introduce Dean Knox. The title of his talk is The Need for a General Causal Framework to Study Police Violence. Dean Knox is an assistant professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and a co-founder of Research on Policing Reform and Accountability. He develops statistical techniques to measure racial bias in policing, evaluate policing policy reforms, and improve the performance of policing organizations. So with that, Dean, if you'd like to share your screen, you can take it away whenever you're ready. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction. So my name is Dean Knox. I'm co-founder of Research on Policing Reform and Accountability, or ROPRA. That's together with Jonathan Bamolo, who's also here and is part of the work that I'll be presenting today. So our team, ROPRA, works to improve measurement and quantitative research in policing and racial bias. And I'm going to be talking about the many challenges that statisticians and applied researchers face in this area, drawing on work that we've done and problems that we've seen in this space in recent years. and especially drawing on ongoing police discrimination cases that we're working on for the Department of Justice and the ACLU. So the challenge that underlies all of the issues that I'll talk about today is that policing data is generated by an extraordinarily complex process. So say we're interested in racial discrimination in the use of force. And so what I mean by that, the quantity of interest here is the causal estimand, what would have happened if a minority had been substituted, or a white person, somebody of a different racial group had been substituted counterfactually into the beginning of a police encounter. Would that have led causally to a differential use of force by officers? And the challenge in engaging in this hypothetical exercise is that there are a huge number of factors that we have to consider and hold fixed. So we have to think about the behavior that the civilian is engaged in. We have to think about the context, where and when, what's going on around as that officer engages the civilian. All of those are things that can factor into the officer's decision to use force. And depending on the context, can also lead officers to encounter civilians of one racial group at a higher rate than another. And it can lead certain behaviors to be more common and so on. So these are factors that we need to consider when we're engaged in this causal exercise. This hypothetical exercise that precedes the statistical exercise of actually estimating that bias. Now, officers typically don't directly escalate to the use of force. And Robin will talk about this more today. They typically stop, engage the civilian in a conversation. They may question or even frisk the civilian before, if things go badly, ultimately escalating to violence. And there are other factors that can play a role in these decisions. So an officer's subjective state of mind, like how suspicious they're feeling, or even if they're just plain having a bad day, can affect their discretionary decisions to detain a civilian and to use force. And this is something that's almost never, it's just never recorded in any data set that statisticians would have access to. There are a lot of other things that can happen during an encounter. For example, if an officer detains somebody on suspicion of selling drugs or possessing a weapon, they could potentially discover evidence that substantiates that initial reason for the detainment. And so that's something that can be used in some of the methods. I'll make some brief reference to outcome tests that use this technique, that information. But before I wade in, I just want to briefly summarize the state of research on discrimination in policing. I think this is an area where there really is a need for this engagement from statisticians, from data scientists in the applied work, because there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of statistical issues in this data that can cause problems, as you'll see. So policing research faces extremely severe data constraints. So part of the problem is that we have this very complex, partially observed process. We often get only limited views from certain perspectives, from the police perspective. And the limited data that does exist is very closely guarded by police departments, who are often reluctant to share other contexts that could inform analysis. So as a result, existing work is often incomplete. So a researcher may go out and have some relationship with the PD. They may get data on, say, traffic stops, right? But not on deployment or other aspects of the policing process. And there's this tendency to focus only on the data that we have, that the researcher has, and neglect this multi-stage nature of policing. Okay? So this fragmented data, these fragmented perspectives, leads to a fragmented literature. So we often see papers that are based on garbage can regressions, where you get a data set of convenience and you just run a regression that controls for whatever factors you see in some linear way. And this leads to a proliferation of incompatible analytic approaches. And really what's going on is that there are unstated, incompatible modeling assumptions that underlie the analyses. And so that leads to contradictory results. It makes knowledge accumulation and meta-analysis almost impossible. So this is a problem that my collaborators and I have talked about over and over again. And the reason this matters is it really is necessary to understand the numerous statistical methods that are currently applied to policing data. So I'll talk about some of these, like benchmark tests, regression analysis using police administrative records, outcome tests, and there are many more. Things like the veil of darkness, comparing officers who are Black to officers who are white, bad apple detection, and so on. And I'm not going to be able to get into all of this, but I will hope to highlight the statistical issues that are sort of at work here. And understanding how all these methods fit together is crucial, because it helps us understand why two experts, say one representing the ACLU and another representing a police department, can analyze the same data and come to seemingly contradictory or even entirely opposite conclusions. A lot of the work that my group has done is focused on how to analyze police detainment records more rigorously. So rather than just using off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box statistical methods, running a OLS on some data set that we found, it's thinking about the causal process, reasoning about what can go wrong, and using partial identification, constructing bounds on best and worst case estimates of the data, of the quantity of interest, this racial discrimination, that are consistent with the data we see. So with that, I'll dive in. I just want to walk through a couple cases that illustrate the severity of the problem and what can be done about it. So as our first case, just one example of the issues we flagged. In this research area, there was recently a prominent study in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences, which claimed, quote, if anything, there's anti-white disparities in police violence, which is just a stunning claim to make. And it's just a stunning claim to make. So here's what the data environment looked like for that particular study. So we have this complex process, but what the authors had access to was data sets on police killings. So the Fatal Encounters data set, the Washington Post data set on police killings. So what that means is we condition on a fatality occurring, and conditional on that, we get to observe some things, but not others. We get to see whether the civilian was minority. We have some information about the context and potentially about the behavior of the civilian, but we don't get to see all the other contextual factors that are going on, which means that we can't possibly adjust for them. And conditional on no fatality occurring, we see nothing, right? So if you think about the vast set of police civilian encounters that are going on every day, every time a police officer goes out on the street and lays eyes on a civilian, right? If we just imagine that as being this box, we can break that down, right? So we know that some of those encounters are going to be with white civilians, most of them, in fact, and a smaller proportion will be with minority civilians. And just for the purposes of illustration, let's hold all else equal. Let's say same place, similar places, similar times, similar behaviors. Now we can break this down even further. Among the encounters that occur, an officer can choose to detain or not detain, to stop or not stop the civilian. And we have a lot of research that indicates that stops happen at a much lower rate for white civilians than minorities. So again, just for illustration, let's say 1/4 of the time an officer lays eyes on a white civilian, they stop the civilian, right? 3/4 of the time, the person passes unnoticed or unobstructed. Now, in a minority community, that might be very different. We might see stops, hypothetically, 3/4 of the time. Okay. And then we can break this down even further. We could look at what proportion of those stops then result in some outcome of interest. So in this case, we're studying police killings. So officer-involved shootings that lead to a fatality and so on. And so among the stops, some proportion of white stops may lead to that fatality. Some proportion of minority stops may lead to this fatality. In this hypothetical example, half of white stops result in the event of interest, and 1/3 of minority stops result in the event of interest. So 1/3 is obviously smaller than 1/2. And so we're going to see this can be the root of some confusion in statistical analysis. When you look at these events of interest in context, what you see is that 1/4 of the time, minority encounters result in the event of interest, which is much larger than 1/8 of the time in white encounters. Right, so here the conclusion would be entirely reversed, depending on what cases we choose to include in our analysis. So I'll come back to this point in just a second. So the Johnson et al. Paper engaged in an approach that we call only studying the events of interest, or selection on the dependent variable. What that means is when they looked out, when we consider the entire space of police encounters, they only looked at those that resulted in a police fatality. And under the hood, behind some statistical jargon, the analysis basically said, if there are more white fatalities, holding X constant, adjusting for X somehow, at the average level of the covariates, we see more white fatalities than there are minority fatalities. Therefore, conclude, this is the quote, if anything, anti-white bias. Right now, of course, in a study that's looking at how often civilians are killed, if you only see the times where they get killed, it becomes very difficult to draw statistical conclusions. And so this is, this basic fallacy is something that underlies quite a few papers in this area. So statisticians will immediately recognize this as a case of selection on the dependent variable. The bounds on this in this setting are very wide. And so it could be the case that every minority who's encountered shows up in this data set. There's a 100% fatality rate. The data can't rule that out. It could be that the reverse is true. There are an infinite number of minority encounters, and almost none of them end up in the fatal encounters data set. Again, the data can't rule these out. So the bounds are very wide. And so we can probe this analysis, say, how is it possible that we're reporting point estimates here? And the hidden assumption, effectively, once we engage in this causal reasoning, is that for this exercise to be worthwhile, for us to learn something from it, we have to assume that minority and white civilians are encountered in equal rates. That's what would have to be true for us to compare the number of killings and learn something about the direction of police bias. Right? Now, this paper was ultimately retracted. But it took us a year of battling against PNAS editors. In the end, it took a letter signed by over 800 scholars across 20 disciplines saying this is unacceptable, this is not how we do statistics, this is not how we do science, before this basic error was retracted. Now, there is a better way to do this kind of study, which is to approximate the racial encounter mix. So this is an approach called the benchmark test. What it says is basically we're going to approximate the proportion of civic encounters that are with white civilians. Maybe we'll use like population or drivership shares of white civilians. And what that gets us is, again, we don't get to see this larger box, this grayed out box. That's the number of white encounters with police. But we do get to see maybe the population is 60% white, right? And the population is 40% minority. And so when we use that as our reference point for the proportion of killings, then our inferences are really going to depend on how good the proxy is. And so there are a number of reasons why proxies can go wrong, why they can lead to overestimates or underestimates of this, what the killing rate would be if it were race blind. And so we need to reason very carefully about the sources of bias in those analyses. I'm going to move on to a second class of very common analytic approaches that are used in studies in this space. And so this is, as an example, I'm going to use Fryer 2019, which is a paper in the Journal of Political Economy, which is a well-regarded econ journal. And so this paper, again, comes to the surprising conclusion that there is, quote, no discrimination in officer-involved shootings, and shockingly little, if we take the estimates at face value, shockingly little discrimination in sublethal force, like tasing a civilian, or handcuffing them, shoving them to the ground, and so on. And here's what the data environment looks like for one of these studies. So this is a data set that was obtained by the police from the police department. So the police department may keep records on stops. All the times where a stop occurs, the officer records a number of attributes of the encounter. So the race of the civilian, daytime, nighttime stop, what the civilian was doing, which may or may not be an accurate portrayal of what was actually happening, and also whether or not force was used. Again, we have this issue where there's limited data, there's fragmented information, because if no stop occurs, the officer doesn't have to fill out a form, and we observe nothing about the situation. Although it's probably safe to assume that if the officer didn't even stop, then they could potentially have, they probably didn't use force, okay? Now, the issue here is that even if we're trying to estimate the effect of minority status on officer violence, there are also, by conditioning on this post-treatment variable, we've induced a collider bias. So I'm using a directed acyclic graph here, but the basic concept is that there's some other reason why we could observe a correlation between race and the use of force. Okay? And so in this particular case, it's going to be because we could have some lower threshold of suspicion for detaining a minority civilian. And so that's going to lead to some very counterintuitive behavior when we analyze the stop records, sort of taking them at face value. But here's what that looks like. Out of all the encounters that actually happen, when we only analyze the police records, what we're doing effectively is subsetting to these, right? All the times where the decision to detain went one way, where the officer made the stop. And so a naive analysis of this would be to say, well, how often is force seen in these stops? So in this case, the hypothetical example, 50% of the time, a white stop results in violence. 33% of the time, a minority stop results in violence. So a naive analysis would conclude there's less use of force in minority stops, therefore, again, if anything, anti-white bias. But that's because we're not considering all the other stops that are happening. If you actually look at the full universe of encounters, 1/4 of minority stops result in violence, and 1/8 result for white civilians, 1/8 result in violence. And so this problem can lead to drastic underestimates of bias and force. So in a study that we ran of the NYPD over the course of a decade, replicating Freier's analysis, we find that a naive approach would estimate 74,000 instances of discriminatory force against Black and Hispanic minorities. But when we actually think about all the times where the officer let a white person pass unnoticed and they didn't show up in our data, all the times where a Black person showed up discriminatorily in our data, and we correct for that, what we find is a lower bound, a best case scenario where there's 300,000 times, 300,000 instances of discriminatory force as measured in this case by laying hands on the civilian. So again, this is a classic statistics problem. It's a post-treatment selection problem. And intuitively, it's that we have minorities who are stopped for as little as jaywalking, where white civilians might, just as an example, be stopped only if they rob a bank. Okay. And by analyzing these police records, taking them at face value, effectively what we're doing is we're comparing force rates that are used against white bank robbers in this example. And we're comparing that number to the force rate for minority jaywalkers and robbers together. And so if those two numbers are similar, that's not an indication of no bias. That should be a horrifying result. Again, when we derive the bounds under a formal causal framework, we find that the research design, the data itself is fairly uninformative. And yet we have scholars who are going out and producing point estimates and claiming, very little bias or if anything, anti-white bias, things like that. And so to probe that assumption in a formal causal framework, we can derive what would have to be true for this to be informative, for us to learn something from this exercise. And the hidden assumption basically turns out to be there can't be any discrimination in that first stage. So if we go back and we look at this directed acyclic graph, if there's no arrow from minority into stop, if there's no discrimination in stopping, then the backdoor path, this red path, falls apart, and there is no spurious correlation. The only correlation that we have is induced by the actual causal effect, right? So that's what would have to be true. But we don't really want to assume away discrimination in a study of discrimination. And so again, we need to think about ways to adjust for that and have our results report bounds, ranges of results that are consistent with the data that we do see. So we've seen this pattern play out over and over. Our group has, someone will make a claim, and then we'll look at it and we'll say, that's odd. In following causal principles, they shouldn't be able to identify that quantity. And that's what having this causal framework allows us to do. It allows us to probe in a very formal way, what is that hidden assumption? And so we already talked about Freier, this idea that we're conditioning on a post-treatment variable, and so that's going to cause problems. There's another paper by a Stanford NYU group that looked at an even harder problem, where there wasn't just selection on a post-treatment variable, but in a setting where even the treatment itself is confounded. So their approach was to say, well, let's just assume that a regression is unbiased. Essentially, just assume that we get the right answer. And it turns out, right? So sometimes people will do this because the data is rich and we have a lot of things that we can control for in a linear regression and so on. But essentially, it turns out for that to work, for that assumption to work, the implicit assumption is, sure, we get some bias from the collider, from selecting on a post-treatment variable, and we get some other bias from the confounder, and then these somehow cancel each other out. Okay, that's what would have to be true for us to take this confounded treatment and this selected data set and run the regression and get a clean answer. And obviously, if that's the foundation of the science, it's not going to lead to super reliable inferences. So again, we advocate really thinking hard about the causal process, and rather than rushing to point estimates, to think instead about the range of possibilities that are consistent with the data we see. We talked about the Johnson et al. Paper, which is another form of selection on the dependent variable, and that again has a hidden assumption that we can probe for reliability. Now, I think these are all issues where anyone with statistical training will immediately see the flaws, right? But the media or the general public or people who aren't as statistically literate can latch onto these claims. And in each case, it takes our group a tremendous amount of effort to set the record straight. So the problem with doing shoddy work in this high stakes setting is that these claims have consequences. So we talked about how Johnson et al. Made a really big splash in the media, got reported all the way up to the House of Representatives in actual testimony on police reform. The Fryer paper and the Johnson et al. Paper were cited by a high-ranking Tulsa PD officer, a major, who said, quote, all the research says we're shooting African Americans less than we probably ought to be. Right, so that's a direct quote from a high-ranking police official who's going out and reading this work. And I think as statisticians, we should be really concerned if flawed science is leading to a flawed understanding of a serious public policy problem that's then leading to bad policy decisions. And so I think that the call that we would put out is to really have people engaging in rigorous research and probing the foundations of this work and just being extraordinarily careful about the claims that we make in these settings. So I'll put this up for a second. These are some of the papers that we're drawing on that are coming out of our group. You can visit our website, policingresearch.org, or reach out with any questions. Stop there.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so we will hold questions until the end, but if you have questions, I'd encourage you, so you don't forget, you can write them in the Q&A, but we will come back to questions at the end. Yeah, thank you again. That was a great, really informative talk. So next up, we have Robin Engel, who will be giving a talk titled Understanding the Impact of De-escalation During Police-Civilian Interactions, Developing a Comprehensive Research Framework. Dr. Engel is a professor of criminal justice at the University of Cincinnati and director of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Dr. Engel engages in police research and evaluations designed to reduce harm in communities and make police-citizen encounters safer, promoting best practices through academic practitioner partnerships. So Robin, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm assuming you can all see the screen appropriately. Give me a thumbs up.
Yep.
Great, thank you so much. Well, Claire, thank you for that introduction. And Dean, what an amazing talk you just gave. I'm a little embarrassed actually to be following behind you. I'm going to start by saying I am not a statistician. So the last stats class that I took, I had to think back. I was trained to use WestVar in the late 1990s to do an analysis with the with some NCVS data and the Police Public Contact Survey by Jim Lynch. That was, I think, the last time I actually paid attention in a stats course of sorts. It was taught at the University of Michigan. And prior to that, of course, was my doctoral work. So I've been out of the statistics game for a long time. However, it does inform a lot of my work. And of course, I've been doing empirical analyses, some better than others, through the years. And what I hope to share with you today is what we know and don't know about use of force studies, but more importantly, what we need to do moving forward, because we are in this large police reform movement, and we have, as a scientific community, great opportunity right now to help inform policy making, decision making in law enforcement agencies, in our communities, to actually reduce harms and to make police citizen encounters safer. And as Dean just articulated to you, sometimes that research is not well supported by statistical techniques and research designs. And so we need to come together as a scientific community, recognize this as an issue, and help push that science forward. If we don't, what happens, of course, is what we just heard about, where we're making decisions almost blind, quite honestly, or sometimes with faulty information. This is a particular personal topic for me because I describe myself as an N of 1. I do not know of any other researcher who became a police executive, literally overnight, taking over a police agency. I know of a lot of police executives that retire, get their doctorates, and move on into the academic realm, but I don't know anybody who goes in reverse. And I had that opportunity in 2015 when we had an officer-involved shooting at the University of Cincinnati during a minor traffic stop about a mile or half mile off campus. An unarmed Black male was shot and killed by a white police officer. And at that moment, the university administrators knew that we had quite a crisis on our hands, and we needed both short and long-term changes to address the issues in policing. And I took over the police agency to do exactly that. So trained as a researcher, I thought most certainly I'd been working with police departments for 2 decades at that point, and I thought for sure I'd be able to go to a body of research to help me identify the best training in use of force, the best policies that were there, that we would have some body of evidence to guide me. And unfortunately, the body of evidence was bare. The cupboard was bare when I went to look. So since that time, we've been really working to advance the science to help police executives to make better decisions for their police officers. So with that, let me see if I can actually control my own slides. That would be helpful. What do we know about use of force studies? Well, there has been a large body of research that's been generated, but as Dean mentioned, there's no real rhyme or reason of how these things fit together. And what and how we count use of force varies dramatically across police departments and researchers. Actually, what we mean by force. So when you saw from Dean's example, all the way on the right-hand side of your slide, even that box, we really don't know much about. Prevalence estimates vary dramatically depending on how force is conceptualized, how it's measured, and how it's reported. So there are these large methodological and statistical variations across studies. Let me give you an example of what this looks like, an actual reporting type of situation. So here's a basic example. This is measuring use of force. And if you think about this as a unit of analysis, in any use of force incident, that incident, it's a police citizen encounter. And you can think about it as an N of 1. And so that N of 1, that's one use of force incident. That's sometimes how we measure use of force. But sometimes we measure it at the individual level. So within that one incident, there could be multiple citizens that have force used against them. And in which case, when we measure it at the citizen level, we're talking about 2 uses of force. But the actual use of force itself, there are different actions, obviously, that happen during a police citizen encounter. And so you could have a citizen that had both a taser and OC spray, unfortunately, or perhaps a physical restraint, et cetera. And so you can see this on the slide here, where then when you're counting the actual use of force actions, now you're at an N of 6. And all of this playing out with multiple officers that can arrive on the scene. It's not just one citizen and one officer. You can have multiple officers engaging with one citizen or multiple officers engaging with more than one citizen. So in this example here, if you're measuring use of force by officer unit of analysis, you would have 3. Of course, this is problematic because most of the time in the use of force data and literature, the analysts don't tell us how they measure actual use of force. And so it's not clear oftentimes what exactly we're looking at. What we also know about use of force studies is that measuring racial and ethnic disparities is fraught with inconsistencies and inappropriate benchmark comparisons. So glad that Dean went ahead and laid that out for you very clearly. But also measuring the factors that predict use of force. So as Dean mentioned, those statistical, legal, individual, organizational, community level factors often have the same limitations as actually measuring use of force itself. So we have those same problems that are inherent in these studies. And this becomes even more problematic when we're trying to examine the impact of use of force on reform efforts. And this is really where the bulk of my work is right now. And I wanted to bring this to the attention of the scientific community. Why is this problematic? What can we do about it? And I'm doing this all through the frame of the example of police de-escalation training. So if you'll follow me along on this example, de-escalation training, we know that this has been widely supported across various stakeholders. It's been endorsed by experts and academics, particularly after Ferguson in 2014. It got a really big push from the President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing when they endorsed the use of de-escalation training. And most recently, of course, we're hearing for calls for de-escalation training, and they're combining this with calls for changes in use of force policies, peer intervention type training, and larger reform efforts. But interestingly enough, despite all of these calls and demands for de-escalation training, there's no uniform definition or even recognition of what we mean by de-escalation. So that in and of itself is problematic. And quite frankly, there's very sparse evidence regarding its effectiveness. And I'll detail that for you in just a few moments, how sparse that evidence is. Now, de-escalation training, there are those that support the use of de-escalation training, and then there are those that have raised concerns. For those that support, they really see this as a common sense approach. It's been perceived as effective for crisis intervention teams, and SWAT teams has been used for many years in law enforcement circles. It's also been used in other countries and considered best practice, particularly in the UK and in Australia. It's believed to reduce the frequency and severity of officer use of force and reduce officer-citizen risk of injury or death. But on the concern side, everyone would say, of course, we need to use de-escalation training and de-escalate these situations. But on the concern side, there's really been no systematic evidence regarding officer risk or safety of using these tactics. And quite honestly, the environment is growing more dangerous for police. We know in the last 5 years, there's been a 26% increase in the reported number of assaults with injuries against police using the LEOCA data. And so we know that the environment is growing more tense and problematic. And so there are cops who truly believe, if I'm trained in de-escalation training, you're going to get us killed out there, because this training contradicts traditional tactics that are believed to be effective. For example, it teaches officers time and distance and cover rather than going in and immediately handling the situation. Now, on the support side, people would say, that's great. That's exactly what we want officers to do. But for those who have concerns, say that moment of hesitation puts us at greater risk and you're going to get cops killed. So the truth is we had no evidence either way. And so back to my putting on my hat as a police administrator, I wanted to change the training in my police agency, and there was no evidence whether or not de-escalation training would actually be effective and reduce officer and citizen risk of injury or death. So like all other police administrators across the country, I was making decisions blindly. Prior to 2019, there was not one study on the effectiveness of de-escalation training. There were for police. There were some studies that were in other fields, and we did a systematic literature review on this. We did find 64 studies across fields. Not one of them contained a randomized controlled trial design. Most of the methods were very weak, and the findings were generally mixed and not particularly strong. We now have studies that have measured changes in officers' attitudes, perceptions, knowledge, and self-reported behavior. So that's great moving forward. But does it change behavior? And when we consider change in behavior, because at the end of the day, that's what we really want to do in law enforcement when we're making these changes in training. So we have to look at changes in use of force incidents, changes in citizen complaints of use of force, changes in the officer and citizen injuries that result from these incidents, and then finally the severity of the force incidents themselves relative to the resistance. And it's this little piece right here on the severity of force incidents that I want to talk a little bit. I'm going to take a little detour with you just to talk about severity for a moment. So with severity, what we know is that it's typically measured on a severity continuum. And we've taken another step too, and we've said, okay, not just how severe is the force, but how severe is it relative to the resistance that's being shown to an officer. And so this has been called the force factor. We've had this around since the late 1990s and trying to measure that relative difference. Police force relative to citizen resistance captures both the escalation and the de-escalation of officers and citizens during that encounter. And keep in mind, officers may use multiple types of force, and civilians, of course, might be responding with multiple types of resistance. And so this type of measure was used to determine whether or not force was appropriate. Well, that was a little bit easier, believe it or not, than it is now. And the reason is because the de-escalation based use of force models are changing, and they're creating a force factor, or the creation of a force factor is now more challenging. Let me give you an example. Here's a typical use of force continuum. You can think about it. This is how officers are trained. This is This one's from Philadelphia PD of this year. And what you see here are the different levels of officer use of force. And those levels are calibrated with the citizen resistance. So as citizens resistance goes up, then the officer's use of force presumably goes up. So you can both escalate and de-escalate down this continuum. Deadly force, of course, at the top, no force at the bottom, and you can see where these things fit in. And this is how officers are typically trained in the United States. Similar graphics you can see here. This is Las Vegas Metro from last year. Same thing here where you have level of resistance that's escalating and de-escalating, officers' response as a result, also de-escalating and escalating, and the different boxes here representing the types of activities or uses of force that are allowed or recommended for the level of resistance being shown. So again, when you measure a force factor, you can say, okay, force factor, the force was here, the resistance was here, and as a result, it's a -2 or a -1 on our force factor. Dallas PD, very similar. And of course, you see the steps here. So again, it's even easier to measure and think about conceptually a force factor. But what happens when we change how we train use of force? So here's a model. Here's the National Use of Force model from Canada. This is a circular model. This teaches officers that at the base is your assessment, your action, and your plan, and that you have a continually changing environment. And so it teaches you to handle things not in a step-by-step method up and down the continuum, but rather to assess and reassess continually. The same is true in Australia, for example. We're here in the center of the circle's communication skills, and there's this continual assessment and planning where all the different types of use of force are the spokes of the wheel going around. Well, that makes it much more difficult to figure out what a force factor would be when officers are being trained on this particular model. So let's then bring it to the US. This is exactly the shifting that's happening right now with de-escalation training. This is called the critical decision-making model. It was put out by the Police Executive Research Forum for their ICAT training. ICAT stands for Integrating Communications, Assessment, and Tactics. It's one of the leading de-escalation trainings across the country. And in fact, we've just learned that the entire state of New Jersey, all 550 agencies will be trained in ICAT by the end of this year. And so ICAT is really moving the field forward in terms of de-escalation training. This is the critical decision-making model where at the center of it are the ethics and values and proportionality, all surrounding the sanctity of life. And officers are taught to collect information, to assess risk, consider your police powers, identify your best course of action, and then to act and reassess. But you're continually spinning the model as the citizen is changing their resistance towards you. So it's not just a linear step up or step down. This may be a little bit more familiar to folks now, given those of you who watched the Chauvin trial out of just a few weeks ago for the killing of George Floyd. And you can see here, this was for the Minneapolis Police Department. They were trained in de-escalation skills. And here's the model that they used and reinforced with their officers about how to assess the type of force that was necessary. So why does this matter for measuring use of force? Well, how police are conceptualizing and reporting force is likely to change as we change the way that they are trained. And this is really important for the severity of force, which in turn really matters for determining the effectiveness of de-escalation training. We also know that these severity measures vary, of course, on just the use of force generally. We know that that's hard to capture. And finally, use of force counts may not decrease even if the training is effective. What do I mean by that? When you take a count of a use of force, it may not be increasing. It may be that less force is being used, but there's still an amount of force, and that de-escalation training may still be effective, but we wouldn't capture it if we're just looking at counts of use of force. So this just presents another challenge for the researchers out there that want to take a look at and better understand uses of force. So Does de-escalation training work? That's the whole big piece, at least for me, one of the most important questions that we have facing the field right now. We don't want to continue training officers in this area if in fact we find that it's not having the impact that we seek. So we have studies that have measured changes in officers' attitudes, perceptions, knowledge, self-reported behavior. Generally speaking, these studies are coming back positively to say that there are changes in officers' attitudes, particularly towards use of force. But are there changes in behavior? We really have to look at use of force incidents, again, that force, for citizen complaints that are complaining about force, their injuries, and also the severity of that force. But it's the change that we're the most interested in, and it has to correspond, of course, with the timing of the training. Well, how do we do that? How do we assess that? Police training has generally not been assessed in our field. It's shocking, quite honestly, that we've been doing this for so long and haven't been able to really build a body of evidence for law enforcement executives. Most of the training, police training that we have uses survey designs. Some use interrupted time series analyses, but we know there are many limitations with those models. Even some difference in difference models that are needed to compare across agencies. Well, that's problematic because different agencies measure use of force differently. So comparing across agencies is problematic. And there are very few randomized controlled trial designs, mostly because these are operationally challenging to administer, but there's also a very strong likelihood of contamination. If you think about you're randomly choosing which officers to train, that trained officer may end up in an encounter with an untrained officer. And so that the contamination effect is really prevalent and problematic for an RCT design in use of force. And of course, there are ethical considerations about we want to train all officers in de-escalation tactics and skills. And so if we're only training a portion, what does that mean for our communities? So what did we do? Well, I wanted to build this evidence base, and we had an opportunity to do something a little bit different. We worked with the Louisville Metro Police Department, and what we did here was we implemented what's called a Stepped-Wedge randomized controlled trial. Now, for you statisticians out there and people who are research design wonks, you know this design is primarily used in the fields of health and medicine and nursing and also in education. But what happens here is there are clusters of research subjects that are randomly exposed to the intervention sequentially over time. So it's a crossover design. Clusters of the subjects begin in the no intervention control group, but they cross over, in this case, as they're trained into the control group. Now, the way that we've done it is we've actually stratified and thought through and created strata with different divisions of police. You can do it by division, by precinct, by beat, etc. This design allows an experimental comparison between the subjects in the clusters receiving that intervention and then the subjects getting conditions as usual. We've also used this to study NYPD implicit bias training. Let me give you just a quick example of what this looks like. So Stepped-Wedge randomized controlled trial design, you can see here graphically, when we put the police divisions together, we randomly select them, and you can see as they're trained, they cross over then into the follow-up period. I see that Claire has joined us here, so I'm going to try to move us along really quickly to get to my bottom line here. But the Stepped-Wedge design, important to note that it really examines the changes in the outcomes corresponding with the timing of the training relative to that pre-training period or the baseline, and then the other divisions, in this case clusters, that have not yet crossed over as the controls. It includes a fixed effect for time, it includes a single term for treatment, and we also look at diagnostic tests to make sure that those clusters have stability pre-treatment. The findings have generally shown in the study with the Louisville Metro Police Department, we did find significant reductions in police use of force incidents that corresponded directly with the training. So reducing use of force incidents, reducing injuries, and for officers and for citizens, which is obviously great news for the field. The study with implicit bias training that we looked at, we had more steps in the wedge. We had 9 steps there. NYPD is a very large agency, obviously, and so we had more opportunity there, but there were no significant changes in the counts or the racial disparities that we were able to detect based on that training. There are lots of limitations of this step-wedge design, but even given these limitations, and I'll have these slides available for you, we believe that the hybrid of a fixed effects panel regression modeling and the interrupted time series make it an appropriate statistical test to measure training effects. So moving forward, what do I really want you to take away here? First, I believe that it's going to continue to be a struggle to compare use of force prevalence and severity across jurisdictions. This is going to happen for the foreseeable future. We're not just going to be able to wave a magic wand and suddenly everybody measures everything the same and that we have all the data that we want or need. The greatest opportunity for standardization is at the state level. But even so, most states have not standardized their use of force reporting or their training or their model policies. So we have some time to wait. In the interim, what can we do to be meaningful? We have to help our law enforcement agencies and support these police reforms. And so my recommendation is that we develop a loose framework that provides agencies with their own opportunities to appropriately change within their agencies. We want to look at the change compared to themselves. Those types of designs, we don't need to standardize necessarily to have meaningful research right now. Okay, it's not ideal in the long term, but in the short term, there's so many things that we can do. So here's where I'm going to encourage you: support police reform moving forward. We need to strengthen the research designs and analyses to support these pre-post comparisons and changes within agencies. We need to help develop basic data and analytical guides that are useful for agencies and policymakers and communities. This has already been done. Actually, Police Executive Research Forum is putting out some. I know the Police Foundation, who you'll hear from next, Travis, is going to likely be able to reference some of their work that they're doing as well. We have to support new data collection sources. It's not enough just to count uses of force. We have to count things like whether or not de-escalation tactics were used and whether or not they were effective in order to really measure what's happening. We need to invest more in research that examines content-rich data sources. So rather than just relying on what the police department gives you, we need to take that next step, look at systematic social observation, for example, code in our narratives, look at body-worn camera footage and code those, and of course do interviews with both officers and citizens. And I want to encourage our group to really refocus the efforts to appropriately measure racial and ethnic disparities. Kudos to Dean and his group. I'm so glad people are taking this on. It's really needed. But finally, my final point is to say, we really need to get the scientific community more engaged within agencies and communities. So many of us as academics are on the outside. We pull a data set, we analyze it, and we publish those findings, and then we move to the next step. Well, the problem with that is when you're not really involved and embedded and understanding what those police citizen encounters actually look like, then you make mistakes in those analytical designs. And we need to be better about understanding the actual context of which we are studying. So with that, if you have any questions about my work, if there's statistical questions, ask Nick Corsaro. He is fabulous and knows all his stuff. If you have substantive questions that are not statistical, you can ask me, and you can follow our work. We are partnered with the IACP, International Association of Chiefs of Police. It's the largest police executive membership organization in the world, 33,000 members, 165 countries, and we are their research arm. So when we do research, it then gets disseminated to the field, and I'd be happy to disseminate your research as well. Thank you, Claire, for allowing me a few extra minutes to get all of that in. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just as a reminder, yeah, we're going to have Q&A at the end. But yeah, thank you for that presentation. The final talk is by Travis Riddle. The title is "Why Don't We Know More About Officer-Involved Shootings?" Just as some brief background, Dr. Riddle joined the National Police Foundation as a data scientist in October 2020. He's previously held positions at the National Institutes of Health, Princeton University, and Columbia University. He has methodological expertise in multi-level models, Bayesian inference, and text analysis. He's applied his skills to projects in education, health, media, and criminal justice. So yeah, thank you for being here, and you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks. Robin, I think you need to unshare your screen. Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for attending for this, and thank you for inviting me to be a participant in this excellent series of talks. So as Claire suggested, I'm going to talk to you today about why we don't know more about officer-involved shootings, and I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach in comparison to the previous panelists, insofar as I'm really going to dig into the details of one specific effort to try to collect some rich data around some of these events and some of the barriers and problems that we encountered. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge some of the other folks who have contributed significantly to this project. So in particular at the NPF, the research director, Travis Taniguchi, the president, Jim Birch, and one of our research associates, Maria, have all done excellent, extensive work on this project. And there's an untold number of people who worked on this project well before I came on the scene. And I also want to say that my treatment of this topic today is going to be pretty clinical. So partially that's just my personality, and it's also partially because I just want to like efficiently communicate what we've done here. But I just want to say that whatever cold presentation style I may have is not meant to be misconstrued as any kind of lack of empathy or compassion for the lives that these events can destroy. Okay. So I suspect that the overall trend hasn't appreciably changed in a long time, but in the last few years, we've seen a number of instances in which the use of force by police has received significant public attention. And I kind of trace the real uptick in noticing these events to around when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson in 2014. And since then, we've seen these events increasingly capture the attention of police departments, politicians, and the public. And in a lot of ways, the public attention on these issues has preceded the kind of extensive quantitative research that we might expect and hope for, given how sharply these events have shaped the public discourse in the last half decade. So in this short period of time, there's been some efforts to understand use of force, but these endeavors, as some of my previous panelists have pointed out, have been hampered by a lack of good data. So of the work that has been published, a non-trivial amount has come from these large crowdsourced data sets, including those compiled by The Guardian, the Washington Post, and the Fatal Encounters database. And indeed, in the absence of any other good data sets, the Bureau of Justice Statistics has actually endorsed the Fatal Encounters as a good source of data for this kind of work. And some general findings from work conducted by in these areas is that the number of killings per year remain constant at around 1,000. People of color appear to be overrepresented in these databases, and frequently there's no firearm or weapon present when somebody is killed. And then also this kind of echoes something that Dean really focused on, is that these databases only focus on fatal uses of force, which presumably make up a pretty small minority of all use of force cases. And besides these crowdsourced efforts, there's a couple of other data sets that people have tried to use to answer similar questions. So for instance, the CDC's National Violent Death Reporting System includes extensive data on all violent deaths, including police shootings. Connor et al. Showed that this is looks to be a pretty promising source for these data, but unfortunately, this data set only covers a subset of states. I think it's 27 the last time I looked. And then there's also this National Vital Statistics System, and this paper by Edwards et al. Is on the kind of lifetime rate of being killed by police according to various demographic groups. But they have this really extensive piece in the appendix where they go through this particular data source, the National Vital Statistical System. And it seems to suggest that the NVSS is undercounting police killings. So reflecting on the work that has been done, and especially some of the work highlighted by Robin and Dean, we can see pretty clearly that there's a lot about officer-involved shootings or uses of force that we don't know. In particular, we're missing the kind of nuanced, detailed information about these events from heterogeneous agencies that we would want to know, just to have a base of knowledge about, like, you know, what do they look like? When do they happen? So with this kind of information, we could better understand things like what kinds of situations prompt these, how do they progress from start to finish? So for instance, how many are initiated by officers? How many are in response to officers being called to a scene? What does the dispatcher tell the officer if there was a call? And are there characteristics of officers or details of their work that make an officer-involved shooting more likely? So for instance, are they more likely to happen if an officer has been working a very long shift? And then also, how often are there investigations? Who conducts them? And how do these investigations turn out? So in an effort to answer some of these pretty detailed questions, the National Police Foundation, with funding from Arnold Ventures, partnered with the Major Cities Chiefs Association to develop an online data collection tool that's focused on officer-involved shootings. And the idea here was really that this kind of resource could benefit both parties, right? So that NPF would get a high quality, granular data set covering heterogeneous agencies, and the agencies in turn would receive monthly analysis and feedback. This is something that I think agencies would value because OIS, officer-involved shootings, are fortunately pretty rare, even in large departments. This rarity makes, as you know, you statisticians would know, would make drawing inferences from them pretty challenging. And so pooling data from multiple agencies could potentially help to address this problem. So the data, the officer-involved shooting data collection that the National Police Foundation undertook went live in late 2015, and we had extensive follow-ups with agencies who participated through I think the summer of 2018. We ultimately received data from 56 agencies. These covered 1,600 individual officer-involved shooting incidents, and those included a little over 2,500 officers and 1,750 subjects. And you can see we asked, a range of questions about these events, including date, time, precipitating facts, whether the officer was called to the scene, what the dispatcher said about the call, details of the officer, including their demographics, their work history, like whether the officer had received citizen complaints in the past, if they sustained any injuries during the event, and then questions about the subjects, including their demographics, whether there was resistance, if there was a weapon, if there were mental health or substance abuse issues. And I really want to emphasize that the folks running this project went above and beyond to try to get as much information as possible. I wasn't with the NPF at the time, but I suspect that by the time data collection of this project was done, that the people at the agencies that we had partnered with were pretty tired of hearing from us. And then also say that when I joined the National Police Foundation last fall, this was one of the first data sets that I was given to work with. And as you might imagine, seeing such a rich data set described this way, I got pretty excited for some of the interesting analyses I was going to be able to do with it. But I was pretty soon disabused of that excitement. So this figure illustrates the rough rate of missingness for each variable in the data set. The variables for each of the data types are arrayed along the x-axis, and the y-axis shows the proportion of observations in each variable that are missing. The only variable that's totally complete across all three tables is the index. Almost anything else has really high rates of missingness, including plenty of things that I think I and most likely anybody else looking at this data set would go to first as something that we would be interested in. So we can see that officer education, for instance, is nearly totally missing. The question of whether there's a pursuit, also almost totally missing. Race is missing for more than 80% of observations for both officers and subjects. So yeah, I mean, you can see that this data set is pretty problematic. I also say that these are rough rates of missingness because there are a good number of variables for which we did not enforce data entry standardization. So some of the available data isn't usable. So for instance, we asked about officer shift time, and although some of those responses are sensible, others just say like 7. And so, you know, what do you do with that information? So that's the first takeaway, is that while this data set is not quite unusable, the possible uses are pretty constrained due to the amount of missingness that we encountered. And I'll again point out, this is despite us following up multiple times with these agencies to try to get them to report their data. So we thought that given this, maybe we could try to connect the data to some other outside data sets. And as a first step, we wanted to see how it generally compared to some of those more frequently used crowdsourced data sets that I had said earlier. So we filtered the Washington Post, the fatal encounters, and our own officer-involved shooting data set by date, time, and location to create comparable data sets, because each of these differ slightly in the scope of cases that are included. And we see that our officer-involved shooting data, I'm sorry, the text on this is a little small, but the officer-involved shooting data, which is this green line at the bottom here, appears to be undercounting the number of cases that we should have, you know, expecting what the number of cases that we should expect based on what we see in fatal encounters or the Washington Post. And so this is of course true for the years that, you know, are outside the kind of central focus of our data collection period, but it's also true for the primary target year of 2016. So in 2016, fatal encounters has 245 cases that look like they should be in our data set, but our data only recorded 168. So at this stage, I'd come to the conclusion basically that the most interesting feature of this officer-involved shooting data was the fact that so much of it was missing. And so I wanted to see if I could find some kind of quantitative explanation of why this might be. So we merged the 3 data sets together and attempted to run some analyses to see if there was something systematic of why a case was missing from our data. And so moving forward, I want to be clear that all these analyses, well, all the analyses that I tried were totally exploratory. I tried different models, different variables, different transformations of variables, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing here should be understood as anything more than me just looking at a bunch of associations and seeing what, if anything, is noteworthy. So I think Dean referred to this, I think affectionately, I'm sure, as a garbage can regression. So this is exactly what I was doing. And so, yeah, so you can see the number of cases that we've got. There's, you know, 2,300 some odd total cases. We're missing 1,750 of those. Just in 2016, looks like there should be 269 cases, and we're missing about 111. So besides the data that we were able to compile from these 3 databases mostly about subject level characteristics, so demographics and things, we also took agency level data from the Law Enforcement Management and Administrative Statistics, the LEMAS. So this collects data from a sample of little more than 3,000 law enforcement agencies, including every agency with more than 100 sworn officers. And since our data collection was focused on some of the biggest law enforcement agencies in the country, they were all included in the LEMAS. So I mentioned I tried a number of different things, but I'm just going to present the results from one analysis here. And so this corresponds to a reasonably complete set of covariates in comparison to some of the others I used. And those covariates break down into 3 different general types. So the first are the kind of demographic features of the subject and of the department. And I thought of these as kind of like the nefarious variables, wherein if there was some systematic underreporting of people of a particular race, or if in departments that were, you know, racially homogeneous, that there was some kind of underreporting there. So those kinds of conclusions would show up in those variables. Then there are these more kind of structural variables about department size, budget, training requirements, resources, et cetera. And then there's a year component, which clearly plays a big role, given that we targeted data from 2016, but ended up with data from years before and after that. Also, because there are missing data in the LEMAS, we handled that missingness using multiple imputation and then fit a multi-level logistic regression. Okay, so these are parameter estimates from that regression model. And really what you should take home here is that we're really not able to precisely estimate very much. So these huge uncertainty intervals on the Blau indices in particular, I think are attributed to, or can be attributed to missing data in the LEMAS. So a Blau index is a function of the proportion of staff that fall into a number of different racial categories. And so if data is missing for one of them, then that is going to kind of propagate forward. Additionally, the kind of subject level variables, so the subject race and their age and demographics do not appear to be at all informative of whether a case is going to be missing from our data or not, suggesting that the kind of nefarious story that I alluded to before is probably not really the case here. There are a couple of suggestive items that tended to recur across different specifications that I've tried. So in particular, we see that the number of technical support staff is pretty consistently associated with missingness, although confusingly, this kind of depends on whether they were sworn or non-sworn technical support staff. So sworn technical support staff would be people who have arrest authority versus non-sworn staff, they do not. And sworn staff appear to be positively associated with a case being missing. So the more sworn technical support staff, the more likely a case is going to be missing from our data, and vice versa for non-sworn staff. So I'm open to suggestions about how to interpret that particular technical support issue. My best guess at this point is basically that the relative rates of those two employee categories, even though they fill a pretty similar role, suggest something about how departments prioritize or value those kinds of technical support staff who are, often the ones helping with data entry and data collection and things like that. Yeah, so those relative priorities could just reflect something more general about how departments take these efforts, whether they take it more or less seriously. But again, I'm open to suggestions. So I guess the take home from that kind of garbage can regression is that I really can't see anything nefarious going on here. And realistically, any barriers are more likely to be structural. And stepping back from the kind of nitty-gritty analyses, I can speak a little bit more confidently about other broader data collection issues that this project faced. And so as an illustration, just consider the typical timeline of events here. So this is just like an illustration, but the length of this timeline around some kind of use of force or officer involved shooting could be as short as a few weeks, or it could be well over a year. And so if, as a researcher, you're interested in a lot of these nuanced, detailed questions about officer involved shootings or uses of force, where in this timeline would be the best time to collect data? I think, unfortunately, no matter where you target in this sequence of events, there's going to be some information that is not known, either because it has been forgotten and was never recorded, or perhaps it hasn't yet been discovered, or perhaps it was never possible to be known in the first place, right? If an officer fires at somebody and that person runs away and are never caught, there's going to be a lot about that person that you're just never going to find out. Additionally, our group ran into plenty of limitations on what agencies can legally share due to state or local laws, or based on their agreements with police unions. And finally, for some agencies, this is especially true. The reporting the information that we had requested of them ended up being more akin to, for each individual event, ended up being more akin to small research projects for the people who were tasked with giving us these data. And this is because data is often housed in different databases within the department. Some databases these people may have had experience with before, others they may not have. And some of the data might not even be housed within the law enforcement agency that we're talking to. So for instance, if you have outside parties do these investigations, perhaps some of the data set is with that outside party, and so you need to go track that down. Additionally, some of the data set could lie with the courts, and so you might need to track that down. So it's a huge burden on the person or the team tasked with reporting these data. So if I were to restart this project today, I think I would vigorously push for a few different changes. First, I think it's a mistake, although an understandable one, to try to capture as much information as we were attempting to capture here. As you increase the range of variables that you're interested in recording, the reporting burden on the part of agencies and individuals significantly increases as well. And so I'd focus on one or maybe two areas of interest and really kind of constrain the number of variables that we were asking agencies for to those. Second, where possible, I think it would be good to get the raw case reports themselves so that we could code them. So this is clearly a more onerous undertaking on the part of the researcher, but assuming we could get those data, which I know is often a steep assumption itself, it would buy us a ton of flexibility. And then this is also true for other kinds of like internal documentation. So, things of like footage, body worn camera footage, having that kind of like raw data on the part of the researcher, I think would help. And then finally, I think it's good to think about these research projects insofar as how you could leverage external sources of data to reduce the reporting burden on the part of agencies and personnel. So for instance, if you want to link to the NVDRS, you could just not ask about a whole bunch of questions with respect to the subject, provided you collected enough information to be able to link it to individuals in that data set. And then thinking more broadly, I think I'd like to emphasize that if we want to know more about police use of force, then we should be prepared to pay for it. Data like this does not happen for free. I think, despite us living in this age of data seemingly everywhere, like all of that data costs something. And I think that's particularly true for issues that are sensitive like this one. Additionally, I think it's probably worth our while to think about allocating resources to a broader range of policing activities. So this is kind of hitting on some of the things that both of my previous panelists mentioned. So, if we could imagine this data set that I've presented, even if it were perfect, we're still conditioning on police-citizen interactions that rise to the level of a use of force situation, which is a small fraction of all interactions. If we really want to understand, how these things occur, when they occur, we need to know more about the entire pool of those interactions. And to do that, we need data on a wider variety of interactions. And then finally, I also want to point out that everything I've said and done today largely reflects the view from some of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country. There's over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and the agencies that I've focused on today are almost certainly not representative. They're some of the larger ones. And so when we try to think of solutions to some of these issues that I'm pointing out, it's wise to account for the fact that many of these agencies have just a handful of staff. And so whatever solutions we might come up with, we need to think about how they could possibly and practically be adopted by agencies with few people who perhaps lack the technical training that we might hope that they would have. Okay, with that, I'll thank you and turn it over.
Thank you. So I'll ask our panelists, if you don't mind, to turn your video back on. We'll open up the Q&A. Many people have been posting. Some of our panelists have been active responding to some of those questions. Thank you. If you do have any other questions for the panelists, we have quite a bit of time for a discussion. We've planned until shortly before 3 p.m. Eastern time for any questions. So please do feel free to put more questions into the Q&A. There are a few questions still there. I'll ask one of them about so Madeline asked, another possibly important variable might be individual officers' history of use of force, like in a previous job or city. So I'm not sure if any of you want to comment on how you've seen that be approached in the past, the use of individual officer history.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly talk about in the data set that we had collected, we attempted to ask about officer history within that department. But I think the largest barrier there is that that the agencies that we had partnered with were prohibited from sharing a lot of the information that we were interested in about these officers. And that's just within the same city. If you imagine trying to like trace that officer's employment history to other agencies, that becomes a much more complicated task. Like, who would you even ask to learn that information? Just it's not tracked, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add one more thing, and I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on it. I've seen some use of force data sets that have like an officer ID. They don't necessarily have any identifying information other than that, but they have an ID, and sometimes there's some limited demographic information. Do you see any potential problems in using that kind of information, or do you have thoughts on a way it should be used? Directed at any of the panelists.
Well, I think one of the concerns with looking at an officer's history is that you need to understand the deployment context that surrounds that history. So where was the officer deployed? Were there more likely to be encounters in those particular areas, or as part of that assignment that were more likely to experience citizen resistance, those kinds of things. So you have to take into account that. But I do know that there are some studies, very limited in number, but there are some studies that have looked at officer propensity, if you will, based on their history. And it's really difficult to sort out that piece of it, that deployment piece that's directly associated with likelihood of use of force. Dean, I bet you have encountered some of this with some of the work that you've reviewed.
Yeah, this is a great point that Robin raised. Deployment is part of the puzzle that we didn't get to talk about much. But if you think about the grand scheme of things, why, if a minority goes out and lives their life and they engage in some kind of behavior, and a white person goes out and lives their life and engages in the same kind of behavior, to what extent they're subject to differential use of police violence, a huge part of that story comes in what we call policy bias, or the differential allocation of resources to minority communities. Even before you think about the encounter starting, there are just more officers around to see that behavior. And then that compounds with all the other factors, perhaps bias in the decision to stop, bias in the decision to use violence. All these stages can compound. And so that's something that police departments, I think, and Robin can weigh in too, they're very reluctant to share deployment, because I think there's this perception that it compromises policing tactics, or like where officers might be. In the Chicago Police Department, some of my collaborators, Bokhar Bad and Roman Rivera, were able to actually obtain freedom of information requests for shift level patrols. So that's what beat an officer was in, what time they showed up, if they're on special duty. And having that information is hugely important to tackling this question. And it also allows us to adjust for a lot of other things that traditionally we're not able to do. So if you want to compare two officers, for example, comparing Black and white officers to assess diversity initiatives, if you want to do some sort of bad apple detection, if you're able to compare two officers in the same place at the same time, even though we can't measure and adjust for all these contextual factors, having that patrol information is hugely helpful, because you can assume that they're facing a lot of the same external context. And so that allows us to get a much cleaner estimate of either detecting outliers like a bad apple thing, or comparing these two groups.
Dean, is that the article you're referring to? Was that just published in Science, the one that came out? Yeah, so that was for me a little bit of a game changer, right? It was the first time that we had been able to see that in a systematic way, where there was deployment data that was included in better understanding those interactions, but also, of course, the racial makeup of both officer and citizen.
Great. So there's a question, I think, mostly aimed at Travis. He says, I might have missed it, but it was unclear what the inferential target was when collecting the OIS data. Suppose there was no missingness. What is the quantity you'd learn about that? Would be helpful for understanding or reforming police shooting.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great question. And unfortunately, this would require me to go back a little bit and infer the motivations of the people who had started this project. Part of me thinks that this was like a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and so everybody had a different inferential target that they were hopeful for. I think the general agreement was that having a wide range of information about characteristics of these events would at least give agencies and researchers on staff an idea of, like, you know, what are the base rates and how often do these things happen. We were also planning to, I think, collect roster level data from these agencies. So we would be able to say, like, you know, of those who are represented in this data, they, you know, we see that Black officers are more or less represented, you know, things like that. But, you know, as I think is pretty clear, we ran into some pretty severe data collection challenges here. So, but yeah, I'm not totally sure what the original inferential targets were, but that's a great point.
Yeah, thanks. So there's another question. Have there been any studies done that analyze where officers live in relationship to the beats or districts they patrol? Are any of you aware? I'm not aware of any myself.
I can take that one. I don't know that there are any specific studies that have looked at that directly, but I do know it's a very controversial issue right now. So a lot of things when we talk about police reform and we're throwing out ideas and we're trying to innovate and think through how we can better improve police community relations. And this is one of those where we kind of say, well, we should have officers that live in the communities in which they police. It's getting pushback, interestingly enough, a lot from some citizens who don't want their officer that they know and have known for years who works in their neighborhood taken away simply because they don't live in that neighborhood. Other communities have a different response. And the same is true with law enforcement officers who believe, you know, some believe, look, I care about this community. I might not live there, but I've invested years of my work in this community. So for me, it really comes down to the quality of policing that's received, whether or not that individual officer lives in that neighborhood. I think it's really about the quality. But that's my opinion. Have we systematically studied that and what the impact is when we make those changes in policies? I would say off the cuff, I don't believe it's been systematically tested. I'm not sure about that. Dean, I'd refer to you if you've seen anything, any study directly. I have not.
Right, and they added some additional context. I'm thinking of Ferguson, Missouri, specifically, where which has a largely white set of officers that is seen as an occupying force. Okay, so we're gonna go to another question. Are there any ways to encourage law enforcement agencies to collect better data internally? Are there incentives needed or particular barriers facing law enforcement? I know there's been some discussion of staffing already and access to technology and other resources, but yeah, I think probably all of you have different perspectives on what an ideal data set looks like, what it would take versus maybe a more realistic data set.
So the barriers are many and they're pretty big. So I think there are certainly some cultural barriers. You know, oftentimes I think agencies are reluctant to, I think Dean referred to this a second ago, sometimes agencies are reluctant to share some types of data because they think it'll kind of share the secret sauce, so to speak, about, you know, how their police agency works, whether in that there's a fear that that could harm their ability to fight crime. But I think that the by far the largest barriers are just that, you know, if an agency is given, let's say $100,000, what are they going to do with that money? It's probably not going to, very rarely will it be used for investing in data infrastructure and data collection, because that's not usually the need that is at the forefront of what they need. Unless there's some direct pressure put on these agencies from politicians, from the citizens that they serve, I don't think you're going to see a lot of uptake in terms of, you know, sharing big open public data sets, especially on the national level. And then I think it's also worth pointing out, so I made a point about this at the end, is that the vast majority, I think a lot of the discussion that takes place around this issue is, people are thinking of these like big agencies like Chicago and New York and LA and stuff. And that's what, 50, 100, a couple hundred of those. The vast majority of these agencies just employ a few people. And so like, imagine an agency that has 5 or 10 people and you're expecting them to like rigorously collect a ton of data on everything that they do. It's just not, it's difficult to see how that would be possible on an agency to agency basis, unless you had some higher level kind of infrastructure built around a lot of these smaller agencies. But I'm not really sure what that would look like.
Just to follow up on Travis's point, which I think is a great one. I mean, a number that's often bandied about is there are 18,000 local or state law enforcement agencies that all have different data collection practices. The data environment is hugely non-standardized. So as Travis said, in many large PDs, we're recording stops, which is a big step forward. In certain PDs, there's freedom of information requests that can get us certain kinds of data. And that allows us to do better research. But if we want to do this in the most rigorous way possible, we have to sort of analyze the data environment and determine what we can estimate, what we can bound in any particular place. And that's something that is very difficult to do. So I think a couple questions in the Q&A from Jeffrey Morris and David Banks talked about being potentially able to fuse information from multiple sources, like doing a public survey that tells us something from the civilian perspective, getting some limited data from the police perspective. Again, there's a lot more that we don't see. Potentially we can measure some of that with body cam data, some sort of automated way to extract these information, extract the like escalatory or de-escalatory actions as recorded on body cams, kind of like what Robin was talking about, and then fusing this in some principled way. That's I think a pretty important area to be working. So our team has actually been trying to do this by developing automatic bounding techniques to take this data, sort of convert it into a principal stratification problem, and then solve it in a pretty automatic way by minimizing and maximizing that polynomial program. But I think there's need for a lot of different perspectives, a lot more work in this general area.
And I'll just jump in here just to mention about sort of accessibility of data and willingness of police departments to give that data up. I think it is true for some agencies that they are very guarded and protective of that data, but in part it's because sometimes when there are the public record requests, that information goes out, it's analyzed by newspaper reporters, not done in a very statistically sophisticated way, and they live with the policy consequences of that. So I personally, as a researcher, I've not really had difficulty going and partnering with a police agency and getting access to data, including very sensitive data. And I suspect that our research community, I think that there would be more receptivity than you might otherwise think. If you literally go and meet with your local police chief and have those conversations about how you'd like to use the data and how you can use that data to help them improve their own their own work, I found that most agencies are willing to partner. And one final story, I'll just tell you, it was like the high point of my career. I was working with the Cincinnati Police Department. It was in the late 2000s, and I had been working on them about data and data analysis and how important evidence-based work is. And we were doing these weekly meetings where they would use that data and talk about problem-solving strategies and whatnot. And one day when they went up to put up the presentation, the data wasn't right. And I saw police executives mad, fighting over, why isn't this data right? We've got to clean this up. This is a disaster. How can we make decisions if we can't trust our own data? And I thought, I've won. I won because they're fighting over data, right? A lot of agencies know and recognize the value of data. They also know the limitations, and they are looking for partners to help them sort through it.
Great, thank you. So there are a couple of questions about body cameras. So there's a general question: has anyone looked at the use of body cameras as a factor? There's a more slightly added on to that: selective use may be a problem with body camera data. It may not record the whole incident. So yeah, you just brought up body cameras, but maybe we could expand a little bit on that idea.
I can jump in first and then let my panelists take over from there. There has actually been extensive research on the impact of body cameras. That most of that work has been actually supplemented by philanthropic organizations. There have been also some federally funded studies. Generally, that body of work has been compiled by Cynthia Lum and her colleagues, and generally it finds mixed evidence regarding the impact on use of force of whether or not officers are wearing body cams. So that's one piece of research. But thinking about body cameras as a data collection tool is a different piece, right? And how we can use that footage to actually code encounters and better understand the interactions and the use or lack of use of de-escalation tactics and skills. That's ongoing. There are a couple of different research teams that are working on that systematic coding opportunity for body-worn camera research.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and flag. That was a basic, great summary of the state of the state of the field. Body cams don't seem to be living up consistently to the promise that we thought, in terms of like creating an accountability tool, having officers are aware that their actions are being recorded, and there was, I think, at the onset optimism that would lead to better behavior across the board. One of my collaborators, Anita Ravishankar, has worked with David Yoakum and Alex Kopik in DC, where a randomized controlled trial didn't really show the benefits that we expected to see from body camera, a randomized deployment of body-worn cameras. And so we think that, so Jonathan Momolo and I have spent a lot of time talking to police chiefs. And one of the problems is there's just so much video being generated. You can generate thousands of hours of video a day. And even the best intentioned police chiefs go and they ask their sergeant, randomly select an officer, randomly select a video or look at the last encounter they had, review that. And even that is a tremendously time consuming exercise to go through minute by minute and see what's going on and then intervene. And the chances that you actually spot the bad behavior that you're trying to address are very low because, again, many encounters are innocuous. So our team, this is joint with Olga Rusakovsky and Brandon Stewart, and Jonathan Momolo. We have automated coding of body cams. This is precisely what Robin was mentioning. What can we extract out of this information stream? And I think what we'd like is this almost like a movie script. The encounter begins. I know there's some questions in the chat about selective decisions to activate the body cam, and that's certainly a problem. But let's just say the encounter begins. The officer says this. It's said in a, it's like stated in a calm tone of voice. The civilian responds. At some point, somebody escalates. They're gesturing. We want to capture that from the visual stream. We want to capture this whole sequence of escalatory and de-escalatory behavior up to the point where an officer lays hands on the civilian or handcuffs them. Those are all actions that we want to code out of the stream. And depending on what you want to classify, it can be difficult. There's a lot. This is a messy body cam environment. From a computer vision perspective, there's a lot of occlusion. There's a lot of shakiness in the camera that makes it difficult. You only get a partial view, so you get officer hands, but then they go out of frame. So you may not know when a gun is drawn all the time. You're trying to interpolate temporally. In terms of audio, there's mic breaks because people are shouting so loudly that it really distorts the ability to transcribe automatically the text. So these are all issues that we've encountered. Even from an annotation perspective, it's traumatizing for people to watch these events over and over of police, again, laying hands on civilians. And so there are a lot of issues in really standing up this whole workflow. But that's something that we've been trying to grapple with.
And the private sector as well has been working on this. So for instance, Axon is the primary body camera company. They're working right now to develop that technology so that agencies themselves can look through and find the person with the red ball cap, right? Or things like that, and to identify and be able to do that automated. But that technology is developing, but it's not there yet.
Great. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So there's a question that says, even if we were able to surmount these data collection challenges, what sort of research could be done to further understand use of force and to make empirically supported policy recommendations? In other words, even if we had perfect data, what would there be a significant deviance from the current policy recommendations that are currently in discussion? and yeah, I mean, it's hard to know that without it, but yeah, your thoughts on what would you do if you had this ideal data set? Maybe a combination of these records, administrative records, maybe a combination with body cameras. What would you do if you had it?
So, I mean, I think our role as statisticians is really to measure in a rigorous way the problem. So I think, you know, the discussions that we've had, you know, things that other panelists have raised point to there being many stages at which there could be discrimination in the deployment of officers, in officers' decisions to engage a civilian initially, to escalating that process in a discriminatory way, to ultimately using force in a discriminatory way. And we just need to understand where things are going wrong. Now, Robin has a lot more experience in terms of like what interventions could potentially, once we identify that, what interventions can we actually, you know, can we consider to address that problem? And some of it may be retraining officers, some of it may be redeploying, but that becomes a much trickier question where we have to weigh competing interests. You know, yeah, it's a very difficult problem.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, we have been making decisions in criminal justice on with low to no evidence for decades. We often find then that there are unintended consequences as a result of that, and then we try to recorrect, often creating more unintended consequences, right? So the research always seems to be behind the policymaking. So in an ideal world, if we were on the front end and the research was really driving the policymaking, what would that look like? To be honest, I really can't even quite envision that, but I suspect that we would still have policymaking that is driven by political interest and not necessarily by the research, which means we're still going to have policies with unintended consequences, and we're still going to be needing to work directly with law enforcement agencies and communities to build that evidence to continually correct and have constant improvement over time. That's so not a great answer, but that's sort of how I would see the world.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if to expand on that a bit, I think each of you and a little bit has talked about collaboration with police departments. I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit more, what that experience has been like. Robin, you mentioned that you found overall that they're pretty receptive. Is there information that you think most police departments are willing to talk about openly versus maybe only specific if you have like a data sharing agreement? Do most police departments use data sharing agreements with your group, Dean, maybe perhaps? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, I'm clearly the senior one of the group. I'm the old one, so I've been doing this a long time. So I can tell you that when I first started working on it, I never used data share agreements because a lot of things were just, you know, it was personal interaction. And so there was a trust level in police departments or with community leaders, and I could just navigate that way. Now, in the last 10 years, I always use a data share agreement. Why? Because it protects the police agency, but it also protects us, right? And so it's very clear from the onset exactly what data we're going to use and how we're going to use that data. And I think that that's important for researchers to lay that out just so that the expectations are clear. I've gone into so many agencies after a researcher has been there and has burned some bridges for the rest of the research community because those expectations were not clearly laid out. And so I would recommend doing that. I have lots of examples that I can share with folks of what a data share agreement would look like. Typically goes through our university. You know, the attorneys get their hands on it and change it however they like, but it does provide that protection. I think that police agencies have really evolved over time. When I first started my career, it was very few and far between agencies that you could really establish a partnership with and get in and do meaningful work that wasn't just a report that was put on a shelf and nobody did anything with it. Now, I really believe, especially in the last 10 years, that is changing. And the partnerships can be very robust. And the findings that come back from research studies can actually then be used by the police department to make changes in their agencies. And I'm seeing that more likely than not these days. So that's my optimistic spin about what's happening in the field.
I'll just add, I think Robin has had quite a bit of success, probably more than anybody else I can think of on this. But it is difficult. We've had difficulties in engaging with police departments. Often a chief can be well-intentioned, but then has to talk to union officials, and there can be protections in place for the sharing of officer information. And you know, the police has to live with those the chief has to live with those consequences if they alienate their union by engaging in this data sharing. So that's not to say we shouldn't do it. It's just that it's complicated. I will add that there are other sources of collaboration. So we work with the Civilian Advisory Commission, the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission, which is the civilian oversight board. I know there are other researchers who have very fruitful collaborations. There, the question is, well, what kind of powers does the Civilian Advisory Board have? Do they actually have access to the data? Do they have to request it in the hope that the police department provides it? Is there sort of selection in what information gets provided? Other than that, I think, so another point is that there is also selection in the kinds of police departments that choose to collaborate. And so Travis mentioned this a little bit. Larger PDs are, you know, maybe approach more, they share information more, potentially, and trying to extrapolate from those experiences, from those findings to the 18,000 other police agencies, many of which are much smaller, may have different cultures, maybe less willing to share. Those findings may not generalize well, and so we have to be conscious of that as well.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, one of the things I actually go and meet with the unions, with the union reps, and I give presentations to the unions, and I let them ask me anything. You can ask me anything, and I'm straight up with them about what the data, what we're using, how we'll use it, but also what could the outcome mean for the police agency. And so working with unions is always challenging, but I think it's a barrier that you can get over, at least in some agencies.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing here, and that, so I have not worked extensively with police departments prior to starting with the Police Foundation in the fall, but I've been surprised on both fronts. Surprised at the level of eagerness to, you know, collaborate with data collection efforts, and also surprised at just like, you know, how sparse the oftentimes the level of expertise within a department to like do these kinds of things is pretty low. And so if you want to be able to train agency personnel to be able to do some of these things on their own, so for instance, the Obama administration issued a 21st Century Policing Task Force that suggested that, you know, lots of different types of data should be collected in agencies. And when agencies tried to implement this, they just like were, you know, grabbing at straws. They didn't even know really how to begin in a lot of cases, not in all cases. But aside from police departments, there's also a challenge here insofar as like one of the things that we want to know is like, how do communities feel about their police? And getting communities to engage with that issue is also extremely hard. This, I think, is more akin to a lot of other problems that social scientists tend to tackle, like, you know, how does the general public feel about X? But in this particular instance, I think there's been a lack of effort and attention devoted to like trying to understand like, how does our community feel about this particular thing that, you know, the police agency has tried to do. And so that, you know, that's another component here too, I think.
Great. So there's a specific question about agent-based modeling. Have you seen any efforts using agent-based modeling around use of force in your experiences?
So I have not personally seen this. There is a econ literature that that is sort of grounded in the idea that we can assume certain patterns of responses by civilians. We can assume like a functional form over responses, like a distribution over responses by the police, conditional on what they see about the civilians. And so you could, in principle, imagine building an agent-based model around that. I think our general philosophy is that these are sort of black boxes, very hard to unpack what's going on inside the mind of the officer. And so, you know, just as a matter of preference, we don't put a ton of structure on like the exact function of how the officer is going to respond to civilians and so on. But yeah, if there were anywhere that did it, it would probably be in that econ formal modeling literature, some of which is related to like the outcome test. There's some work on this.
Great. There's another question about, I think we just have time for one or two more questions, but there's another on, is there any effort to train civilians on how to react or behave in an encounter?
Well, I know that when, particularly for larger agencies that have use of force simulators, they often bring in civilians as part, or their civilian review board or key leaders in the community to come in and actually go through the training, to use the simulators, to be a part and involved in that directly. But in terms of actually how to train someone of how to act during a police citizen encounter, I think it was the NAACP that years ago sort of put out a guide, and I might be misstating there, it might have been the ACLU, but it's challenging, right? I mean, that's I think sort of better for us to really focus on how to train our professionals that deal with this every day than try to train the mass public of how to react. And keep in mind that a lot of these situations that involve the use of force are with persons who are in crisis. And those persons in crisis may be in crisis because of mental health, drug use, situational stress, intellectual developmental disabilities. There can be a whole host of things that are contributing to that crisis moment. And when people are under those situations, they don't often act rationally, right? So we can train all we want about how this is how you need to do these things, but oftentimes that breaks down.
All right, I think one more question and then we'll close the session. It just popped up in the chat. Is non-compliance with officer requests and orders factored into the data and into the reporting? I think that factors in a bit to the conversation that a few of you have mentioned about resistance and incorporating resistance into this analysis. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
I mean, a lot of these analyses are constrained by what officers write down, right? And that's because our current data stream is based on administrative data sets that are generally provided and recorded by police. And that's one of the reasons why I think standing up this body cam stream of data is going to be so important, because whatever problems may exist with decisions to activate body cams and how they provide a limited perspective, that's all true, but it really is just going to be much more reliable information. So right now, basically, there are checkboxes that say civilian was doing this, or civilian was doing that, or civilian was resisting, civilian was engaged in suspicious behavior. What exactly that means, we often don't know. Whether those things are recorded differentially across civilian racial groups, we don't know. It's just a very difficult problem. So I think the more transparency we have about the policing process, about the escalatory and the de-escalatory actions that are taken, how compliance is asked for. That's one that some prior work is, I think Jessica Eberhardt that has looked at some of this, but how compliance is asked for, what other actions are going along with that, how the civilian responds. That's going to be really important. And we just need better measurement on this stuff, frankly.
Yeah, all of the force factor work is based on the level of citizen resistance, including non-compliance is one of the measures. That work is sometimes based on the actual, as Dean mentioned, click the box of, these variables. But Mike Smith and some of his colleagues, including myself, I was on that research team, have worked to actually go into that administrative data and the narratives and code action by action. Officer did this, citizen did this, officer did this, citizen did that. The problem, of course, is that it's all filtered through the perspective of the officer as recorded, or in some cases, the supervisor, right, that's recording and writing those use of force reports. By the way, sometimes use of force is not even reported by the officer, it's reported by the supervisor. So we have even that disconnect depending on what the agency policies are regarding the data collection. On the next step, systematic social observation, which was done very heavily in the 1990s. We really abandoned that in part because of the cost and the significant time, but we have learned a lot. Bill Terrell has published extensively on use of force using systematic social observation databases, and so have others.
All right, I think I'll give you the opportunity if you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up, to any of the panelists. Any last thoughts?
Just coming back to the, you know, the whole reason we are having this forum, I think it's hugely important to take this, you know, the increased focus that's being paid to policing right now and leverage that. I think it would be a huge benefit to the discipline across, you know, the sociology literature on this, the political science research on this, the econ literature, the public policy, the crim research, to have more statisticians engaged in the process, you know, throughout. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's people that are working in this area are actively trying to improve it. And partners, agencies, civilian oversight boards, local governments, the Department of Justice, everyone is interested in making this better. And so the more help we can get, the better that's going to go.
I'll be even more direct. We have an opportunity to literally save lives. The time is now. We really need to engage as a scientific community and support what's happening in our communities and make those situations improved to reduce harm in our communities and to make police citizen encounters safer. We need your expertise. There are not enough of us that are doing this work right now to provide the evidence base that's necessary so that we can make good policy decisions moving forward. So we need your help. This is not a competition thing. This is not like we're trying to exclude everybody. We want people involved and engaged. So I hope that you'll take that on.
Yeah, I mean, I just reiterate all of that. I think you're right to be a little bit daunted by some of the challenges here because there are many and they're pretty big. But, you know, I think being challenged just can be a good thing. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who like working on challenging problems. And this is one in particular where if you see success with respect to some of the challenges that you're trying to tackle, you know, that can have like a really, really big positive impact in people's lives. And so, you know, I encourage people to get involved with this kind of work.
Yeah, it definitely has the potential to be extremely impactful, that's for sure. Yeah, so the next steps for this panel series, forum series, we are thinking about having an in-person meeting in the fall, or another couple of virtual meetings. So if you do have feedback on that, I would encourage you to send me an email, put that in the chat, let us know. I will stick around for a couple of minutes in case people do have feedback that they'd like to put in the chat. We are also thinking about writing a more extended white paper to talk about the statistical issues around use of force. But if you have thoughts on either a topic or speakers that you'd like to hear from on police use of force, specifically the statistical issues around this topic, please do let us know. And the last thing I'll say is that everyone who registered will get a link to an evaluation survey after the close of the event. So please do let us know your thoughts on the survey. And we'll definitely appreciate your thoughts on the forum. Jim, did you have anything else?
Just to say thank you, Claire, for moderating this, and for Robin, for Dean and Travis. This was great, and I liked your closing comments. We hope we can do some follow-up, and I lost my internet here about a minute here at the end. So if you want to be part of any organization of follow-up events, put your email, maybe you said this already, Claire, put your email in the chat. You can also put it in the evaluation, and you can email me. My email address, JLR, is on the Zoom link that you received. So again, a big thank you. We will post these slides and the video on our NIST.org/news in a few days. And we hope to get this word out. It is a timely discussion we've had today. Thank you very much.